I'm converting this channel from scale modeling to restoration. Nah, just kidding. But yeah, this video will be equal parts restoration and scale modeling, because tonight I'm trying to save this poor little KV-220-2 from PST in 1/72nd scale. This video is gonna be the first part where we tackle the construction, and then we'll do some painting in the upcoming videos. Hey guys, what's up? So, as you know, I decided to spend some more time working on less demanding projects, and this is another one of them. This video will be slightly longer than usual, so if you wanna grab some drink or a snack, now's your time. I guess you'd like to hear the full story behind this model, so here it is. One of my friends gave this model to me several years ago. He just built it and then sprayed with what I presume is some Humbrol dark green enamel paint or something. And he's an aircraft modeler, and this was his first and last tank. And he also built it many years ago, so this model is pretty old. It even has dust on it, which is actually pretty disgusting. Okay, better. Now, I'm not gonna be overly critical towards my friend. He was less experienced when he tackled this kit, and tanks are not his main focus, so it's all understandable. But let's just say this kit isn't the best choice for your first tank ever. It's an old PST 1/72nd scale model, which should already raise enough red flags, and the kit has 158 parts, and all of them are like the movie The Nun, because none of them are good. Anyway, as you'd expect from someone's first time building a tank with link and length plastic tracks, which are terrible by the way, my friend ran into some issues. The gray spot is where he placed the tarp in order to hide the gap, but it was made from aluminum foil and I removed it a long time ago, when it was actually when I first received the model from him. Yeah. I think I would also have similar problems if I ever attempted to put together tracks that are this bad, but I don't think it's anything tragic. I mean, sure, they look really bad, but I know it can be saved with mod effects, which unfortunately I won't do in this video, but later on. What a cool way to start a video, right? Talking about something that I'm not gonna do, especially something that looks so awful. Anyway, there was a tarp here as well. There were some tow cables, which were made from plastic, and one of them was actually broken. The running gear is okay, I guess, except it's full of flash and none of the return rollers are actually round, so yeah, that's interesting. The headlight, which he by the way drilled out, nice work there bud, was barely holding in place, so I removed it. He also added some missing weld beads on the turret. These are clearly made from stretch sprue. This, I honestly have no idea what this is, and this is a kit feature by the way. I mean, it's obviously an armor cross-section with flame cut marks, but it actually looks like insulation foam, so yeah, not cool. Machine guns, they look like they came from some Japanese tank, but hey, my friend drilled them out, so nice. Box handles, whew, exhausts, okay, I guess. The air intakes have no mesh detail, but what would you expect from an old kit? The towing eyelets were glued in wrong position, because they would obviously never hang like this. And there are a lot more smaller issues, but I'll address them as I progress with this restoration. Overall, on a scale from 0 to 5, where 3.6 is not great, not terrible, I'd give this model 2.6. More terrible than great. Let's now try and make it a 4.6. More great than terrible. Starting with the turret. The flimsy open hatch was barely holding in place, and I would definitely break it sooner or later by accident, so I broke it on purpose. There's a lot of unwanted texture under the paint. I don't know what this is, but I'll have to sand it. This was first done with a sanding stick, which I used for more brutal steps, and then finished off with a polishing sponge. The mantlet cover is overly thick, and it ain't even oval as it should be, so I sanded it as well. This took care of both problems, but I'll get back to this detail a bit later. Now I decided to remove those weld beads made from stretch sprue. They didn't look great in some places, so instead of trying to fix them, I thought it would be easier to make new ones. I wasn't able to sand the ugly cross sections flush, so I had to fill them with putty. Seems like instead of fixing stuff, we're just creating more damage at this point, but that has to be expected. The side vision ports are completely out of scale and make this model look more like a toy, so I filled them as well, but this time with 2-part epoxy putty. Why, you ask? So I could punch in a new, more accurate vision port. I'll obviously have to sand all of this, so let's remove those few surface details as well. After letting both putties dry overnight, I could now sand everything down. In situations like this, you have to be careful and make sure not to distort the shape of the turret. And boom! Now I could scribe in new panel lines between each armor plate. Scribing into dry Tamiya putty is more difficult because it's brittle and it's easy to chip it away. Because of that, I was very careful and didn't put any pressure on my scribing tools. Those tools were the razor saw, which I'm using right now, and then Tamiya scribing tool, which has a wider blade and it's great for enlarging panel lines. And then I cleaned up each line with a few passes of Mr. Cement S. Unfortunately, the turret roof is too short, as it should hang over the front plate like this. It could have been an easy fix if the model wasn't already assembled, but this way I'll just have to leave it as it is. I also removed the ugly machine gun barrel and cleaned up the rest. Unfortunately, the spherical gun cover doesn't have a correct shape, but I'll just add a few details and just leave it. But first, let's do some other stuff. Flame cut marks are great little details that can enhance any armor model, especially a heavy tank. They are an efficient way to make your models look heavy, and this technique works for both large and small scales. I've already made a detailed tutorial about this, so I'll leave a link in the description, and it should be also in the top right corner on your screen. With all the cuts done, I brushed small amount of liquid cement over them in order to create a nice smooth surface. I had to be careful on those parts covered with putty because too much cement would start dissolving it. Now I went back to the gun mantlet cover and carefully scraped off the plastic from the inside to make it look thinner. This is a super efficient method if you want to make oversized plastic parts look like sheet metal. I think the comparison speaks for itself. Most, if not all, KV-1 tanks had these extra armor plates next to their gun cheeks. They were missing in the kit, and I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I thought it would be a nice little detail to add, so I quickly cut them from plastic card and glued them in place. Now I was finally able to add some light armor texture. You have to be more restrained when working on small scale models, especially in a case like this, because these are rolled steel plates, which were much smoother than steel castings. Again, I have a detailed tutorial on this technique, and it's actually the same video where I explained the flame cut marks. Link in the description. Now I needed to make those missing details on the sides. So I took a 0.6mm drill bit, inserted it into the pin vise from the opposite side, making sure only a small piece was sticking out, got a piece of rubber and tinfoil, and punched out tiny metal rivets. I learned this technique from Darren Thompson. Thanks man, I really appreciate it, you're an absolute genius. Then using my favorite black super glue, I fixed them in place. Black super glue is great because you can see it. So you know if you're doing a messy job or not, and it's also very easy to clean with debonder, which is another one of my favorite modeling tools. It dissolves super glue. Yeah, Captain Obvious. This piece is actually a pistol port plug, but it looks like a large rivet, so the technique was the same. I did the same thing on the main periscopes, and I also drilled out their optics. They were just bland pieces of plastic, so even though these details are simplified, it's at least better than nothing. I also decided to fix the hatch in a closed position. The roof armor is overly thick, so there's no point in showing that. And I made sure to glue it from the inside in order to keep everything clean. The machine gun ball was detailed using photos from a walk-around. By the way, I highly recommend googling walkarounds for each model you're building. It's always good to know how the real thing looks up close, and you can often find so many interesting details which can make your model look better and also more accurate. Not to mention more details equals more interesting paint job. The machine gun barrel was cut from a hypodermic needle, and yeah, it isn't the most faithful representation of the real thing, but it's the best I could find at the moment. I think the difference is again quite noticeable. And now I finally started adding the missing weld beads. I also have a very detailed tutorial on this, and again you'll find the link in the description, or you can just click the tab in the top right corner. This is, by the way, the first time I'm adding welds made from epoxy putty on a small scale model. I always used stretch sprue before, but I'm not a fan of that technique because it can get quite messy. So it was good to realize that 2-part putty can produce nice results even in smaller scales. Then I just added a few missing details made from 0.2mm copper wire and the turret was finished. Just like that. The hull was pretty much the same thing, but there was a lot more to be done. So just like before, I started by sanding any imperfections in the old paint and then polishing the surface with sanding sponges. I think it's important to mention that many people would decide to strip the paint down using specific chemicals like paint remover or brake fluid, but this model is painted in a thin and relatively smooth layer of paint, so there was just no need to go the extra mile. Then I removed those ugly details and also the spare track. I wanted to add it to the other side, but then I found much better use for it. You'll see. While I was trying to remove the thick buildup of superglue with a chisel, a piece of track just fell off. Okay. So it was better to play it safe and avoid any more brute force, which means I had to remove the old superglue with debonder. There was also some minor damage in those places, so I quickly filled them with Tamiya putty and then gave them another round of sanding and polishing. The bow machine gun was also removed, and here you can see that I removed the headlight and the horn and also fixed that area with putty. But this wasn't exactly necessary, as you'll see later. This is the type of project when you just keep coming up with new ideas as you move along. Now I added the flame cut texture to every armor cross section on the hull. Obviously, I had to remove the paint first, and this was done by simply scraping it off with the same hobby blade as I'm using now. If you saw my armor texture tutorial or even my Type 5 Cheery build video, then you probably noticed how I'm deviating from my usual order of techniques. That's because when you're trying to fix a model such as this one, you suddenly have so many tasks in front of you and you can... I don't know, get confused, I guess? Just like you saw before, one moment I'm polishing the surface, the next I'm chopping off a machine gun. It's all over the place, I know, but it's a lot of fun. After you create flame cuts, you'll often see excess plastic hanging over the side of the plate. This is the type of effect we don't want, but it's easily removed by gently scraping it off. Normally I would now apply liquid cement on top of them, but in this case I had to first create the weld beads. Now this is quite an interesting situation. The kit already comes with these pre-molded straight lines on the upper hull, which are supposed to replicate weld beads, but they are just straight smooth lines. So I added lots of tightly packed perpendicular cuts which will represent the weld bead texture. This is the same technique as the stretch sprue method. The only difference is that I don't need to use the stretch sprue because it's technically already there. This is just the first pass though. Now I applied a generous amount of liquid cement over the flame cuts and on the weld bead. This will make the effect smoother and the plastic more workable, which is very important. With the plastic partially melted, I gave the weld bead another pass with the blade. It's now much easier to carve in the final texture of the weld line. I was careful not to accidentally damage the finished flame cut texture, which would be very easy considering the plastic is still somewhat soft at this point. The other one on the left side is already done, by the way. And now one more pass with liquid cement. It's a pretty simple technique, but I'm not a huge fan. I just feel like the epoxy putty method creates a better result. Yet in this case it was easier than rescribing the weld lines and creating new ones. I should have removed those sewing eyelets earlier, but I was lazy to do so because I never enjoyed this kind of plastic surgery. Razor saw is a very handy tool for this and many other tasks, so if you don't have one yourself, I highly recommend it. What I did next with the eyelets was hard to film because honestly they're hard to even see, but essentially I removed most of the paint, scraped off the mold lines and also the axle caps, which should be round circles, but they were anything but that. Now I decided to scratch build some extra armor. At this point I'm totally jumping from one thing to another, but like I said earlier, sometimes you just have to go with your creative flow. I never liked this type of additional side armor on KV tanks. I think it looks goofy. The other type, which is like a metal 2x4, yeah, it actually looks like a wooden 2x4, but it's not wooden, of course. Anyway, yeah, I like that one. But these combs or whatever are they supposed to be, I just don't like them. Yet I still decided to make those specifically because they totally fit this tank. And yes, I'm totally creating some artistic license here. This tank was supposedly made as a single piece in Leningrad. And if you've seen some tanks fighting around Leningrad, you know they've built some weird stuff there. Too long didn't read, or more like too long skipped forward several times, bulky additional armor fits the theme of this model. And it fits it so much I also suddenly decided to scratch build the front plate as well. This one was quite complicated, but I actually managed to cut it from a single piece of styrene on my first try. Later on I decided to add even more extra armor, but we'll get to that. And yeah, I know I didn't make the additional armor on the glacis plate because I was just so lazy I didn't feel like doing that. Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's what it is. It was now when I realized I can't avoid this anymore, so I manned up and dealt with the stowage box handles made by my friend. Or at least I tried to deal with them, or to man up, because I mean, dude, I don't know what you use to glue them in place, but it has to be some serious high quality shit, because they were impossible to tear off. Feeling absolutely defeated, I pushed as much of what remained as I could inside, sanded the rest as much as possible, and then I just buried everything under a pile of putty. I've never seen anything like this, but I'll have to talk with my friend because I need that super glue. Now I had to make new handles, and I actually tried to make them look more accurate. Of course they're simplified, and I'm not gonna say that it's the best that can be done in this scale. I was just lazy, or more accurately, totally mentally drained from those old handles, which had to be made from stalinium or something. I also wanted to rescribe each box so I could make an illusion of the box lid, but unfortunately their sides were hardly accessible and I didn't want to try to break them from the fenders. Maybe next time. I'm kidding, there won't be any next time. Time to make some metal details. This one was so simple it took less than a minute to make, and that includes bending it into curved shape using my blade handle. This is the deflector. Deflector? I don't know, that thing on the back. These were usually bent in every possible direction, and details like this can add more texture and also some delicacy to otherwise chunky tank models. And they also contrast nicely with those thick armor plates. Now, like I said, I initially wanted to add some details to the spare track and use it like a spare track, but then I got a better idea. First I had to make it one link shorter. For this purpose I didn't need to do a clean job, although my bootleg Dremel tool did surprisingly well. And now I was able to fit it between the gap in the tracks. So now I don't need to cover it with a tarp, just with some mud later on. So in the end I used the kit provided spare track to fix the main track, just like the crew would do in real life. If this didn't totally blow your mind, then I don't know. Then I figured it was time to add some subtle armor texture to those curved back armor plates. And it was at this point that I realized I have to get real and start working systematically. So what I'm gonna do is to work my way from the back of the hull towards the front. The next glaring issue were the exhausts. Here I already fixed somewhat fixed, the left one. And what I did was to make the opening a little larger and more symmetrical, although it should have a square shape, but whatever, I had to work with what I had. And then I rounded the edges as best as I could. Then I covered them both with a light layer of diluted putty. Not essentially to add texture, but rather to give them a cleaner look. Not great, not terrible. Okay, now this is where I really ran out of options. These large boxes are air intakes, and there should be a huge mesh there. But unfortunately, I don't have anything that I could use to replicate that. I don't know, there were only two options. Either I could pretend like, I don't know, there are just some boxes, it's just a model, bro. Or I could do at least something about it. Well, I chose the latter, and the best thing I came up with was to make some sort of standoff sheet metal protection, against shrapnel grenades or Molotov cocktails. I know, Russians never used anything even remotely similar to this, but there were a few examples on German armor, especially on King Tigers and Panthers. And besides, this tank is essentially a Leningrad urban legend, so it's not even a what if, but rather why not. Anyway, it looks more steampunk than Soviet, but I'm sure some paint will change that. I don't know. It looks interesting, I think, although I'm not sure if it looks good. Anyway, moving on. There are two missing fuel cap covers under the turret, so I made them, very simplified mind you, by punching 2mm circles from plastic sheet. Now I decided to add more additional armor, and again this was common on later versions of KV tanks because the turret ring was very vulnerable. So this edition is 100% inspired by the real thing. I would like to mention that gluing plastic to a painted surface is interesting. And there was also one more filler cap, which I noticed later. Okay, I think the armor kit looks pretty sick. That is, until you attach the turret, which obscures everything. Anyway, moving on. The antenna mount cover was a solid piece of plastic, so I had to drill it out with several drill bits, each one being larger than the previous one, until the sides of the tube were paper thin. I actually managed to make them so thin I was even able to add a small dent. Battle damage. Then I drilled out a small opening all the way through and added a piece of brass rod, which will serve as an antenna mount. The antenna will be added after the model is completely painted because for now it will just get in the way. The bow machine gun was detailed the same way as the one on the turret, nothing new to see here. Then I drilled another hole up here because that's where both cables for the headlight and the horn come from. And this is an interesting detail. They're actually protected by a steel tube, so this wire doesn't represent the cable, but a tube. I decided not to use the kit headlight or the horn, and instead I just added the electric junction and their mounts made from copper sheet. There are a few photos showing KV-1 tanks with them missing, so why not? It adds character, I guess. And now I could finally add all the missing weld beads on the hull. And then I glued the towing eyelets back in place. Because I cut them off earlier, they now had a pretty loose fit, so I had to fix them with super glue. The reason why I'm only adding them now is so I could easily add the weld beads that are behind them. And I also added new axle caps made using the punch and die tool. The very last detail was a tarp. I normally wouldn't go for it because if you're even slightly familiar with my work, you probably noticed I almost never add stowage or tarps. I just don't like painting them and I'm not very good at it as a result. So I just avoid them if I can. But here I had a damaged section of the fender and it was in such a tight place that I wasn't able to fill and sand it. So a tarp was the only logical solution. You can always hide your terrible mistakes with mud and tarps. And yeah, I almost forgot. So I made this tarp from the same Tamiya 2-part putty which I used to make the weld beads. I rolled it into a thin piece, then cut it into a square shape, and now it's just about folding it and trying to make it look as interesting as possible. This is a small piece of advice. When you're adding tarps to your models, always try to make as many folds as possible so they don't look totally flat. More folds means more details, and it will be also easier to paint the tarp if it's more detailed. In this case, I'm even using some offcuts to add more details. And yeah, right now the tarp is quite flimsy, but when it solidifies, it will hold as if it were glued in place. Or at least, it should. I mean, so far it always did. I don't know, and honestly, I'm too lazy to stand up and go check. But anyway, that's the last thing I did on this model. So, that's it for tonight. Restoring or rebuilding an old model is more satisfying than you'd think. Even though the result might not be as perfect as if you were building a fresh new kit, there's still something that feels, I don't know, rewarding. You know, when you just pick a model that would otherwise end in a trash bin and just do your best. But at the same time, you're not making a fuss about it and you're just having fun. I don't know, but it feels good. So let me know if you did something similar as well and if it was worth the effort. And if you actually made it all the way to the end of this video, say strong tank in the comments to confuse everyone who just clicked through and didn't watch the whole thing. The next part will be obviously about painting, and spoiler alert, this tank will have winter camouflage. The hype is real, right? Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful or at least interesting to watch, and if you did, please leave me a like because it helps me a lot. The more feedback this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it to fresh new eyes. And also subscribe if you haven't yet, because I keep posting videos like this all the time. So if you liked this one, you won't miss the upcoming ones. Thank you all for watching, I'll see you mates in the next one, and here are some bloopers. What I did next with the eyelets was hard to film because honestly, but I was scared. Then I just I wasn't able. I'll obviously have to sand all of this, so I'll obviously there's still something that feels very. So far it always did. After letting both parties there.